January 1942, victory fever grips Tokyo. The triumphant shouts of Banzai echo through the streets, celebrating an empire expanding at lightning speed. In just 1 month, the rising sun has cast its shadow across the Pacific. From the Philippines to Malaya, the unstoppable Japanese war machine consumes territory, overwhelming Allied forces with shocking intensity. To the architects of this conquest, it seems the war is already won. But aboard the combined fleet flagship, the mighty Yamamoto, one man harbors a dark premonition. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant strategist behind the Pearl Harbor attack, sees not the glory of the present, but the peril of the future. He had warned the politicians that Japan might run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, he held no confidence of success. Now, watching his predictions of early victory come true with terrifying speed, Yamamoto feels a growing dread. Japan was like an octopus spreading its tentacles, he told a friend. But he knew this euphoria could not last. The nation he knew best, America, was a sleeping giant, and the attack on its fleet had stirred it to a terrible resolve. Yamamoto understood that Japan's only hope lay in a swift, negotiated peace, one achieved after a stunning victory that would compel the Allies to the table. But as his subordinates grew drunk on victory, a dangerous arrogance was setting in, a belief that Japan was truly invincible. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Staff was consumed by this victory disease. The Army and Navy quarreled over where to strike next. Some argued for an invasion of Australia to cut America's lifeline to the South Pacific. Others looked to India, hoping to link up with their German allies in the Middle East. Yamamoto, however, had one singular obsession: the American aircraft carriers. They had escaped his trap at Pearl Harbor and now roamed the Pacific, a constant menacing threat. He knew with chilling certainty that until they were neutralized, Japan would never be safe. While Japan's leaders debated their next grand conquest in Washington, a plan born of pure desperation was taking shape. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, facing a nation reeling from defeat, needed to strike back. He demanded a direct hit on the Japanese homeland, a psychological blow to shatter the myth of their invulnerability. The idea was audacious, a mission with almost no chance of return: to launch 16 Army B-25 medium bombers, planes never designed for such a task, from the deck of a Navy aircraft carrier. It had never been done. Many believed it was impossible. The man chosen to lead this mission was a legend in his own right: Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle. Doolittle and his 80 volunteers knew it was a one-way trip. They would take off, bomb their targets in Tokyo and other cities, and then, with fuel running dangerously low, attempt to fly on to the relative safety of China. There would be no fighter escort, no return to the fleet, no margin for error. On April 18, 1942, the moment arrived. Hundreds of miles off the coast of Japan, detected early by enemy picket boats, the USS Hornet turned into the wind. One by one, the lumbering bombers, engines roaring in protest, lifted off the impossibly short flight deck and clawed their way into the sky. Hours later, air raid sirens wailed across Tokyo for the first time in the war. The surprise was absolute. Japanese defenses were caught completely off guard, unprepared for an attack they believed impossible. The bombs fell. The physical damage was minimal: a handful of factories, a few city blocks. But the psychological impact was seismic. In America, it was a desperately needed surge of morale, proof that they were still in the fight. In Japan, it was a profound shock, a deep wound to the nation's pride. The emperor himself had been endangered. The military, which had promised the people that the homeland was inviolable, had failed. Humiliation turned to fury. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Navy's general staff, was heard muttering, "This shouldn't happen. This just should not happen." For Admiral Yamamoto, the Doolittle Raid was the final, irrefutable proof. His worst fears were realized. American carriers could roam freely, striking at the very heart of the empire. The debate was over. The internal opposition from the Army, and even within the Navy, evaporated. The American carriers had to be neutralized, and they had to be neutralized now. His plan, once considered too risky by many, was now seen as the only path forward. It was designated Operation MI, a complex, multi-pronged assault designed to lure the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive, final battle. The target, a tiny atoll in the middle of the Pacific named Midway. Yamamoto was staking everything on this one roll of the dice. He gathered the largest fleet Japan had ever assembled, a mighty armada centered on the 4 veteran aircraft carriers of the Kido Butai, the very same ships that had struck with such force at Pearl Harbor. He was confident, certain that surprise and superior numbers would grant him the victory he craved. But the Doolittle Raid had not only wounded Japan's pride, it had made its leaders reckless. In their haste to force a confrontation, they overlooked a critical fact. American codebreakers had achieved the impossible. They were listening. And at a secret intelligence station in Hawaii, a brilliant commander named Joseph Rochefort was piecing together Yamamoto's entire plan. In early June 1942, as the Japanese fleet steamed toward Midway, convinced they were sailing into a trap of their own making, it was they who were sailing into an ambush. The battle that followed was a catastrophe for Japan. In the space of 5 minutes, American dive bombers, appearing as if from nowhere, turned 3 of their finest carriers into blazing infernos. A 4th would be lost hours later. Midway was more than a defeat. It was a disaster that spiraled out of control. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost its 4 best carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and its most experienced and irreplaceable pilots. The news was so devastating that it was suppressed, hidden even from the Army, known only to the highest echelons of the Navy. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. Yamamoto's great gamble, born from the shock of the Doolittle Raid, had failed utterly. The 6 months of running wild were over. Now a long, grinding war of attrition was about to begin. With the combined fleet shattered, the initiative passed to the Allies. And as Japan reeled from its secret defeat, its attention, and America's, shifted southward. While Yamamoto had been consumed with Midway, others in the Japanese command had been steadily pushing into the Solomon Islands, attempting to cut the vital supply lines between the United States and Australia. On a remote, jungle-choked island few had ever heard of, Japanese construction units were hard at work. Their prize, a flat, grassy plain perfect for an airfield. That island was named Guadalcanal. From this base, Japanese bombers could strike Allied shipping at will, effectively isolating Australia and strangling the war effort in the South Pacific. For the Allies, holding this line was a matter of survival. The airfield on Guadalcanal could not be allowed to become operational. In Washington, the decision was made with grim urgency. America would launch its first major offensive of the war. But the plan was fraught with conflict and uncertainty. General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Ernest J. King clashed over who would lead the operation. The infighting resulted in a clumsy, divided command structure. The U.S. Marines were tasked with taking the island, but they were under-trained, under-equipped, and completely inexperienced in amphibious warfare. Their rehearsal landing on Coral Island was, by all accounts, a complete fiasco. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the carrier task force meant to protect the invasion, was haunted by his losses at the Coral Sea and Midway. He was cautious, informing the Marine commanders that he would only provide air cover for 2 days before withdrawing his precious carriers, leaving the transports and the landed troops exposed. On August 7, 1942, under a clearing sky, the invasion began. As the guns of the escorting warships opened up, impacts blossomed along the shore of Guadalcanal. The men of the 1st Marine Division, led by Major General Alexander Vandergrift, moved into their landing craft, their nerves raw. This was the first American amphibious assault since the Spanish-American War. At 9:01 a.m., the first wave hit the beach. They met, and nothing. No resistance. The Japanese, mostly labor troops surprised by the intense naval bombardment, had withdrawn into the jungle. The going was, in the words of one Marine, ridiculously easy. They advanced inland, finding barracks that had never been slept in, a breakfast table still laden with bowls of rice and meat, chopsticks dropped in haste. The surprise was total. By the next day, they had reached the airfield, the primary objective, without a single engagement. Some Marines began to wonder what kind of war this would be. "I wish those Japanese would come out and fight," one was heard to say. "All they do is run." It was a sentiment they would come to regret. Because just across the shimmering waters of what would soon be called Iron Bottom Sound, on the smaller islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the Marines were getting their fight, and it was a vision of a brutal new reality. Here, the Japanese were not construction workers. They were elite naval troops of the 3rd Kure Special Naval Landing Force, experienced, dedicated fighters who had dug themselves into a labyrinth of caves, coral bunkers, and firing positions. On Tulagi, Colonel Merritt Edson's 1st Marine Raider Battalion, the toughest troops the Corps had to offer, landed expecting a swift fight. Instead, they were met with overwhelming resistance. The terrain was a nightmare of razor-sharp coral and thick jungle, but the real obstacle was the enemy. The Japanese defenders did not retreat. They did not surrender. They fought from their interlocking fields of fire with fierce determination. Each dugout, each cave had to be assaulted directly. The Marines learned to crawl up sheer cliffs, deploying explosive charges into the openings below. Even when a position was neutralized, it wasn't safe. In one hole, after 17 defenders were overcome, a Marine entered to retrieve a radio. 2 survivors opened fire, and he did not make it out. They too were quickly neutralized. This was the first hard lesson of the Pacific War. The enemy would fight to the very end. Snipers were secured into the tops of trees, letting the lead elements pass before opening fire on the men behind them, a tactic with no chance of survival that caused chaos and casualties. The Marines were encountering a warrior spirit they could not comprehend. That night, the Japanese staged a desperate counterattack. They infiltrated the Marine lines in the darkness, and the fighting dissolved into intense, close-quarters combat. Colonel Edson's command post was nearly overrun before the raiders, battered but unbroken, threw them back. The next day, the grim work continued. One by one, the caves were cleared. From one, the Marines confirmed 35 fallen defenders, grim proof of their refusal to yield. In another dugout, they cornered 3 Japanese officers. The Marines heard 3 distinct reports. They entered to find the 3 officers had perished, having chosen their own fate. This was a new, terrifying kind of warfare. The American concept of surrender as an honorable alternative in a hopeless situation did not exist here. Early attempts to take prisoners were met with deception, a false surrender followed by a concealed explosive or sidearm. The Marines quickly and brutally adapted. They met the Japanese on their own terms. It became a war of survival, neutralize or be neutralized. If the fighting on Tulagi was difficult, the battle for the tiny connected islets of Gavutu and Tanambogo was something worse. Here, the Japanese seaplane base was heavily fortified. The attacking Marines were met with a storm of fire before their landing craft even hit the beach. The Japanese had dug their defenses into the slopes of small hills that dominated the landing zones. They poured automatic and rifle fire down on the exposed Marines. Tanks that made it ashore were swarmed by soldiers who jammed crowbars in their treads and tried to set them ablaze with fuel-soaked rags. One tank commander neutralized 23 combatants before he was overcome in close-quarters combat by an attacker who scaled the vehicle. Another then set the tank on fire. The fighting was vicious, personal, and almost unbelievable in its ferocity. Reinforcements sent to the islands at dusk were illuminated by a detonating fuel dump, perfectly silhouetted for the Japanese gunners. The boats were caught in the intense crossfire. The few men who made it ashore were pinned down, fighting for their lives. It took 2 full days of relentless, intense fighting to secure the islets. When it was over, the entire Japanese garrison of over 500 men was lost. Not a single combatant surrendered. The Marines had paid a heavy price, suffering hundreds of casualties. They had won their first battle, but they had also stared into the abyss. Meanwhile, in the skies above, the war was just as ferocious. As soon as word of the invasion reached the major Japanese base at Rabaul, every available plane was sent south. The first wave of Betty bombers, escorted by the legendary Zero fighters, arrived on the afternoon of August 7th. American F-4F Wildcat fighters from Admiral Fletcher's carriers rose to meet them. The Wildcat was slower and less maneuverable than the Zero, but it was tougher and more heavily armed. American pilots, aware of their plane's limitations, were learning new tactics, working in pairs, making diving attacks, and using their superior armor to survive. The air battles were a swirling chaos of automatic fire and streaking aircraft. The Americans took a heavy toll on the unescorted bombers, but the Zeros were formidable. Japan's leading ace, Saburo Sakai, was among the pilots in that first attack. He downed an F-4F and a dive bomber before his own plane took heavy fire from the tail gunners of bombers he mistook for fighters. Grievously wounded, partially blinded, he somehow managed to fly his shattered Zero on a 4-hour journey back to Rabaul, a testament to the skill and spirit of the Japanese aviators. But the losses were mounting. Over 2 days, the Japanese threw wave after wave of aircraft at the invasion fleet. They scored hits, setting the transport George F. Elliott ablaze and crippling the destroyer Jarvis. But the American carrier fighters and the ship's anti-aircraft guns exacted a terrible price. Of one wave of 24 bombers, all but one were brought down. For Admiral Fletcher, however, the cost was too high. He had lost 21 of his 99 fighters. Convinced he could not risk his carriers against land-based aircraft, he made a fateful decision. On the evening of August 8th, just as he had warned, he signaled his intention to withdraw. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commander of the amphibious force, was aghast. The withdrawal of the carriers would leave his transports, still only partially unloaded, completely defenseless against air attack. Mountains of supplies, ammunition, food, medicine, piled up on the beaches, but much more was still in the holds of the ships. Without air cover, Turner knew he had no choice. He too would have to pull out. The Marines on Guadalcanal and Tulagi would be left behind, with only the supplies they had managed to get ashore, to face the inevitable Japanese counterattack alone. But as Fletcher's carriers steamed away into the darkness, a far more immediate and dangerous threat was approaching, unseen and undetected. At Rabaul, Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, commander of the newly formed 8th Fleet, had reacted to the invasion with stunning speed. Leaving the idea of a troop convoy for later, he gathered a powerful surface force, 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a destroyer. His plan was simple and direct, a high-speed night attack to neutralize the American naval force protecting the landings. Mikawa was a master of night combat, an area where the Japanese Navy excelled and the U.S. Navy was tragically inexperienced. He raced down the slot, the narrow channel running through the Solomon Islands, timing his arrival for the darkest hours after midnight. Allied intelligence, which had been so brilliant before Midway, now failed completely. An American submarine and an Australian patrol plane spotted Mikawa's force, but the reports were delayed, misinterpreted, or dismissed. The Allied command believed no Japanese surface ships were anywhere near Guadalcanal. The most obvious approach route for an enemy fleet was left completely uncovered by air searches that day. The Allied screening force of American and Australian cruisers guarding the transports was dangerously divided, their commanders overconfident and their crews exhausted after 2 days of constant alerts. They had no radar capable of detecting surface ships effectively. They had no idea that a wolf pack was bearing down on them through the darkness. Aboard his flagship, Chokai, Admiral Mikawa prepared his ships for battle. Flares were ready to illuminate the enemy, torpedo tubes were trained, and massive 8-inch guns were loaded. He was sailing into what should have been a hornet's nest, but a combination of Allied mistakes and Japanese skill had given him the ultimate advantage: total, absolute surprise. As midnight on August 8th passed, the Allied ships patrolled their designated sectors. South of the small, volcanic cone of Savo Island, the cruisers USS Chicago and HMS Canberra steamed slowly. To the north, the US Vincennes, Astoria, and Quincy did the same. The men were at a lower state of readiness, many resting at their posts after the grueling 48 hours. Just after 1:30 a.m., lookouts on Mikawa's ships spotted the Allied Southern Force. The Japanese cruisers slipped past the picket destroyers, their engines muffled by a rain squall. They were inside the Allied screen before a single alarm was raised. Mikawa gave the order. "All ships, attack!" The night exploded. Japanese float planes dropped brilliant flares, silhouetting the Allied cruisers. A storm of shells and torpedoes erupted from the darkness. The Australian cruiser Canberra was hit by 2 torpedoes and over 24 shells in the first 2 minutes, transforming her into a helpless, burning wreck. The Chicago was struck by a torpedo that tore off part of her bow. Her captain, confused by the sudden chaos, failed to warn the northern force of the attack. Mikawa's column, turning north around Savo Island, now bore down on the 3 unsuspecting American cruisers. The Astoria's crew was woken by the flashes of gunfire. Her gunnery officer asked the bridge, "Are we firing on our own ships?" A moment later, the ship was bracketed by Japanese shells and began to burn furiously. The Quincy, caught between 2 columns of Japanese cruisers, became the target of a merciless crossfire. Riddled with shells and torpedoes, she sank in a maelstrom of fire and steam. The loss of life was immense. The USS Vincennes, last in the line, fought back bravely but stood no chance. She was hit by at least 50 shells and multiple torpedoes, her hull torn open, her decks a scene of chaos and devastation. She sank within the hour. In just over 30 minutes, Mikawa's force had inflicted the worst defeat at sea in the history of the United States Navy. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sunk or sinking. Another was heavily damaged. Over 1,000 Allied sailors were lost in the waters. The Japanese, by contrast, suffered only minor damage. Having achieved a stunning victory, Mikawa faced a choice. The unarmed American transports, the prize he had come for, lay helpless just a few miles away. But dawn was approaching, and he feared the return of the American carriers he believed were still nearby. He chose to withdraw, a decision that likely saved the Marine invasion from total annihilation. But the damage was done. The Battle of Savo Island, as it would be known, was a brutal, humbling lesson for the Allies. The next morning, the sun rose on a scene of carnage. The oil-slicked waters were filled with debris and desperate survivors. The crippled Canberra had to be scuttled. The last of the transports, having frantically unloaded what they could, fled the area. The Marines on Guadalcanal awoke to find themselves utterly alone. Their naval protection was gone. Their supply line was cut. On the island were some 17,000 of them, surrounded by a hostile jungle and a vast enemy-controlled ocean. They had their captured airfield, which they would name Henderson Field. They had the weapons in their hands and limited supplies on the beach. And they had the grim knowledge, forged in the intense fighting on Tulagi, of the kind of enemy they now faced. The Doolittle Raid, a mission of vengeance, had set in motion a chain of events that led to this moment. It had provoked the turning point at Midway, but it had also led to this desperate gamble on a forgotten island at the edge of the world. The easy part of the war was over. The real fight for Guadalcanal and for the future of the Pacific was just beginning. It would be a campaign of savagery and attrition, fought in mud, disease, and darkness, that would test the limits of human endurance. And it would change the nature of the war forever.